Moving on to question 2, we will draw the Nyquist plot for the same transfer function. For Nyquist plots, we always start by drawing the Nyquist plot for a value of k equals to 1. Let's begin by obtaining our zeros and poles. We have a sole 0 at z is equal to minus 10 from the numerator, and we have 3 poles from the denominator. The first is at 0. The second and third are complex conjugate pairs obtained by using the quadratic formula. They have a value of negative 3 over 2 plus or minus 6.9j, and we can draw these poles and zeros on the s-plane to get started with our Nyquist plot. An important metric we want to note at this stage is the number of poles in the right half plane. In this case, we have 0. Let's keep this number to the side as it will be important later in the question. The next step of the question involves us drawing our Nyquist path. The initial Nyquist path is always the same. However, it is interrupted by poles that lie on the imaginary axis, such as our pole at 0. The path begins with a vertical line on the imaginary axis, which starts at the origin, denoted by A. The second component is a half arc, denoted by the letter C. The third component is a vertical line which connects to component C and moves upwards towards the origin. Typically, these 3 lines constitute the Nyquist path. However, since we have a pole on the imaginary axis, we must draw an additional component D that traverses around this pole on the imaginary axis. That is our Nyquist path. The 2 half arcs, namely C and D, are defined by specific parameters. The inner half arc has a radius denoted by epsilon, where epsilon is assumed to go to 0. The outer half arc has a radius denoted by capital R, where capital R is assumed to approach infinity. This will help us determine the specific structure of these paths of our specific transfer function. The Nyquist path we have drawn so far is general. We must now find each part specifically for our transfer function. For part A, we set s equal to j omega and assume that omega begins at 0 and approaches infinity. For part B, we set s equal to negative j omega and assume that omega begins at negative infinity and approaches 0. For part C, we set s equal to r times e to the power of j theta. We assume that r approaches infinity and that the direction of the path starts at positive 90 degrees and moves towards negative 90 degrees. This clockwise behavior is seen in our diagram. For part D, we set s equal to epsilon times e to the power of j theta. We assume that epsilon approaches 0 and that the direction of the path starts at negative 90 degrees and moves towards positive 90 degrees. This counterclockwise behavior is seen in our diagram. Let's begin with part A. We begin with our transfer function. We then set s equal to j omega. After taking some simplification steps, we multiply the denominator and numerator by the complex conjugate of the denominator. This results in a denominator term that is entirely real with no imaginary component. After some simplification steps, this is the final denominator term we end up with. We then begin to simplify the numerator with the goal of separating the real component of the numerator from the imaginary component. After achieving this, we split the real and imaginary components into their distinctive terms and simplify some more. We now have the real component of Lj omega and the imaginary component of Lj omega. For now, we will hold on to this term for part A. Part B is a simpler process, as due to the definition, part B always ends up being the complex conjugate of part A. So let's hold on to this value for now as well. For part C, we substitute r times e to the j theta, as r goes to infinity. After some simplification, we see that since the degree of the denominator is higher than the degree of the numerator, the denominator grows more quickly as r approaches infinity, and takes this entire term to 0. Therefore, part C simply ends up being 0. For part D, we substitute epsilon times e to the j theta, as epsilon goes to 0. After some simplification, we obtain this term, 1 over 5 times epsilon multiplied by e to the power of negative j theta. Since our e term is now to the power of negative j theta, this effectively flips the direction of part B. Its behavior goes from counterclockwise to now being clockwise instead. In terms of the magnitude of this term, we have the term 1 over 5 times epsilon. As epsilon approaches 0, this term will grow to infinity. Therefore, part D has a radius of infinity and has a clockwise direction. We can now update each path on our plot. In order to plot part A, we must analyze points of interest. When omega is equal to 0, which indicates the beginning of part A, the real component of part A equals 0.008, and the imaginary component of part A equals negative infinity. At omega equals infinity, which indicates the end of part A, the real part approaches 0 from the negative side of the horizontal axis, and the imaginary part approaches 0 from the positive side of the vertical axis. Another point of interest is when the real component of part A is set equal to 0. This returns an omega value of 4.5, which then returns a value of negative 0.075 for the imaginary component. Finally, the last point of interest is when the imaginary component of part A is set equal to 0. This returns an omega value of 8.5, which then returns a value of negative 0.047 for the real component. We can summarize this data in a table. Let's try plotting these points one by one to get a better idea of how part A looks. Now we simply just need to connect these points together to get the general appearance of our part A of the Nyquist path. Part A begins at the point corresponding to omega equals 0 and moves towards a point corresponding to omega equals infinity. There you have it, part A of our path. As mentioned earlier, part B is simply the complex conjugate of part A, meaning it's the mirror image of part A about the horizontal axis. Part C has a magnitude of 0, and so we simply find it at the origin, at the intersection between point A and B. Part D is simply a half arc with a radius of infinity, which connects part B to part A and has a clockwise direction. Notice that our Nyquist path sequence has remained the same as before. Part A goes to C, goes to B, goes to D, which ends up back at A. Now that we've created our Nyquist path, we can move on towards using it for obtaining stability data. For stability, we define n counterclockwise, the net number of counterclockwise encirclements of the critical point. This critical point is located at s equals to -1. Each counterclockwise encirclement of the critical point adds 1 to the n counterclockwise term, and each clockwise encirclement of the critical point subtracts 1. For stability, we require that n counterclockwise is equal to the number of open loop poles in the right half plane, the term we stored away earlier. In our case, nccw is equal to 0, and we also have 0 poles in the right half plane as observed earlier. This means our system is stable for k equals to 1. For generalizing our stability to other values of k, we must recognize that the critical points of the Nyquist plot are directly proportional to the value of k. For example, if we double k to a value of 2, the value of where part A of our Nyquist plot intersects the horizontal axis actually doubles as well. Using this knowledge, we can vary the value of k and see how our Nyquist plot adjusts relative to the critical point. When k is decreased from 1 to 0, we see that the critical points of the Nyquist plot decrease in value, and the Nyquist plot moves further away from the critical point at s equals -1. This tells us that the range of 0 to 1 for k is stable as well. When k becomes negative, the entire Nyquist plot is flipped about the vertical axis, encircling our critical point with a clockwise encirclement. This makes our stability criterion false, meaning that our system is unstable for values of k below 0. Let's now return k back to 1. As we increase k past 1, we see that the Nyquist plot grows proportionally and gets closer to our critical point. At a value of 21.28 for k, which is simply 1 divided by the point of interest at 0.047 that we found earlier, we see that our Nyquist plot engulfs our critical point, making our system unstable. This gives us a stable range of k to be between 0 and 21.28. Now we can verify this range by using a Routh-Hurwitz table. Let's begin by obtaining our characteristic polynomial. The d of s term denotes the denominator of our open loop transfer function, and the k n of s term denotes the numerator of our open loop transfer function. We can simplify this term to obtain an ordered polynomial. We can fill in the first two rows of our table by using the characteristic polynomial. We have a3, the coefficient in front of the s to the 3 term. Similarly, a2 is the coefficient in front of the s to the 2 term, and so on. This completes our first two rows. We can now move on to filling the rest of the table. For b1, we multiply a2 with a1 and subtract a3 times a0. This is all divided by a2. Substituting the relevant values, we get b1 is equal to 150 minus 7k over 3. b2 is simply 0 because the third column of our table is empty. For c1, we use the same procedure to obtain a final value of 10k. c2 is simply 0 because the third column of our table is empty. For stability, we require no sign changes in the first non-trivial column of the Routh table, indicated by the arrow. This means either all the terms in this column must be negative, or they must all be positive. As 1 and 3 are already positive, for stability we require that b1 and c1 are both positive as well. b1 is positive for k less than 21.43, and c1 is positive for k greater than 0. The upper range here is slightly different than the value we obtained from the Nyquist plot. This can be attributed to rounding errors during the Nyquist plot calculations. Using the Routh table, we have verified the stability provided by our Nyquist plot.